Here we are again for another episode of the history of Magic the Gathering, told through a card from every set. This week we'll be talking about Lorwyn, a Celtic-inspired world of feuding factions, along with Shadowmoor, Lorwyn's inverted counterpart which makes heavy use of hybrid mana. And finally, Shards of Alara, a world fractured into 5 pieces, one focused around each of the 5 colours. Let's get going. Tribal decks have always been a popular way of playing the game, even before Onslaught Block came along, which gave them a huge amount of focus and support. Just as a reminder, a tribal deck is a deck based around having lots of cards of a certain creature type, or certain creature types, and payoff cards, which rewards you for playing lots of cards of that creature type, or tribe. There's just something fun and cohesive about having a deck which is stacked full of goblins, or elves, or vampires, where the essence of your strategy is just to play lots of goblins, or elves, or vampires, and then play some more until you win the game, watching as they all synergise and support one another with a slew of beneficial effects. By October 2007, Wizards of the Coast felt it was high time to roll out another set with heavy tribal themes. Enter Lorwyn. Lorwyn supports players who want to build decks with goblins, which are available in black and red, elves, which are available in green and black, merfolk, who are available in blue and white, kifkin, which are sort of like hobbits, which appear in white and green, fairies, which are in blue and black, giants, which are in red and white, treefolk in green, white and black, elementals, which appear primarily in red but are scattered across all 5 colours, and shapeshifters, which count as every creature type and were accordingly placed in every single colour. Just like Onslaught before it and Ixalan after it, when drafting or building a deck using cards from Lorwyn, you want to try and build around one of these tribes. However, what distinguishes Lorwyn from other tribal sets is that you could also make a hybrid deck, which cared about multiple creature types. This is demonstrated by cards like Boggart's Sprite Chaser, a goblin which gets stronger if you have any fairies in play, and Elvish Hand Servant, an elf which gets stronger whenever you play a giant. Changelings also allow you to enable all of these cards, and bear all of the benefits and drawbacks of having every creature type. All of this opens up masses of possibilities, and makes Lorwyn incredibly replayable, especially when drafted alongside Eventide, although we'll get into what that brought into the mix a little later. There were even so-called tribal spells, like Surge of Fortweft, an instant which is also a Kifkin, meaning that it triggers effects which care about you playing Kifkin cards, or having them in your hand. But amidst all of the shake-ups brought about in tribal gameplay, Lorwyn also debuted a new card type, which would change the game forever. Ajani Goldmane, Jace Beleren, Liliana Vess, Chandra Nalaar, and Garruk Wildspeaker, known collectively as the Lorwyn 5, were the first Planeswalker cards printed in the game. We'll use Garruk as our card to represent the set, mostly because, well, I feel a bit sorry for him, and I want to give him a spotlight. Jace went on to become arguably the main character of Magic's story. Chandra, Liliana, and Ajani later on joined Jace as significant characters, signing up for the Gatewatch, a league of planeswalkers who travel the multiverse righting wrongs. Whilst Garruk, well, he appeared reasonably frequently until 2014, and then he just vanished for 5 years, only re-emerging relatively recently with the release of Throne of Eldraine in October 2019. So I feel it's fair we shine the spotlight on Garruk, and use him to demonstrate how planeswalkers work. Planeswalkers are brought into play with a certain number of loyalty counters on them, which you can think of as being sort of like their life. Opponents can choose to either target you or a planeswalker you control when they make their attack, with any damage a planeswalker takes dropping their loyalty. They typically have 3 abilities, though this can go as high as 4, or, recently, as low as 1. Again, typically one of these abilities increases their loyalty for a decent effect. In Garruk's case, here he lets you untap 2 lands. Then the next of these abilities costs loyalty for a good effect. Here, Garruk makes a free beast token. And finally, there's an ability which requires a lot of loyalty, more than they interplay with, sometimes referred to as their ultimate, which provides an immensely powerful effect. In Garruk's case, he gives all of your creatures +3/+3 in trample for the rest of the game, and sort of unofficially casts the spell Overrun for you. Although they came along relatively late, a full 14 years into Magic's existence, it's now hard to imagine the game without them. These days, every single set releases with a small handful of them in tow. The Lorwyn 5 are especially notable as, until the release of War of the Spark 12 years later, these 5 Planeswalkers were the only cards of their type available at Rare, rather than at Mythic Rare, a new rarity which would be introduced in Shards of Alara. Morningtide dawned in February 2008. As I mentioned when discussing Lorwyn, before those Planeswalkers came along and stole the show, Lorwyn is a tribal block. The original Lorwyn set cared about the race of your creatures. Morningtide, meanwhile, cares about their class. This makes for a nuanced and complex draft environment. Not quite time spiral levels, but still pretty intricate. Let's say you're drafting Lorwyn and Morningtide together, and you get the card Elvish Warrior, which, I guess as its name would imply, is both an elf and a warrior. This might incentivize you to grab some cards from Lorwyn packs that care about the fact that it's an elf, like Imperious Perfect and Immaculate Magistrate. Or it might drive you to get cards from your Morningtide pack that care about it being a warrior, like Obsidian Battle Axe or Bramblewood Paragon. You can then either build an elf deck or a warrior deck, but unless you get really, really lucky with your pulls and have some top tier deck construction skills, you can't really build both. And you don't want to end up with a pile of mediocre cards that don't all synergize with one another because you are being pulled in two contradictory directions. The crisscrossing complexity of drafting Lorwyn and Morningtide together is best represented by a cycle of cards from Morningtide, known as the Bannerets. Each banneret costs 2 mana and makes cards of a certain race and a certain class cost 1 less. So for example, Ballyrush Banneret makes all of your Kithkin and all of your soldiers 1 mana cheaper. Now I know what you're thinking, and unfortunately these effects don't stack, so a Kithkin soldier only gets a 1 mana discount, not 2. Any one of these bannerets could be used as my card to represent the set, but I'm going to go with Frog Tosser Banneret, because I just love the fact that while all of the other bannerets are proudly raising these noble and intricately constructed standards, Frog Tosser Banneret just has a shredded cape, which apparently counts. You could put this little goblin in a deck with a bunch of other goblins, or slot him in with some rogues. Lorwyn block is remembered fondly for its complexity by many, especially when contrasted with Ixalan, the game's next major tribal set, which was significantly more streamlined and simplistic in comparison. Lorwyn was a colourful and peaceful world. Well, for the most part, the elves were a little bit murdery. But all of that changed with the advent of the Great Aurora, a special event which only happens at one time of the year, at one time of the day, in one part of the sky, localised entirely above the plane of Lorwyn. This Great Aurora transformed the world of Lorwyn into its darker counterpart, Shadowmoor, which is the name of the next set we'll be talking about, which was released in May 2008. One mechanic featured in Shadowmoor, which hasn't returned since, is the untap symbol. We're all familiar with the tap symbol. It goes on a card to represent how they can be tapped down to provide a beneficial effect. Just as Shadowmoor is a strange inversion of Lorwyn, it offers a strange inversion of this familiar gameplay mechanic. The untap symbol means the card can be untapped to provide you with a bonus, so you can attack in with a creature, and then untap it, ready for defense. This symbol isn't the primary theme of Shadowmoor though, and it's a 9 on the Storm scale, meaning we'll probably never see it again, but I just think of it as a neat new aspect of this set. In our last video, we talked about hybrid mana, as something which Ravnica brought into the game. Shadowmoor took this innovation and ran with it, with hybrid mana serving as the set's primary theme. This makes Shadowmoor very interesting to draft. Do you focus on a single colour, grabbing as many hybrid cards as you can, and appreciating the increased consistency this provides you? Or do you take this as a chance to go for as many colours as possible, knowing that it'll be much easier to cast a card that costs hybrid mana? I'll be using Rhys the Redeemed to represent the set. Partially for narrative purposes, as he best represents how Shadowmoor is an inversion of Lorwyn. In Lorwyn, we had a card called Rhys the Exiled. Rhys was exiled from his tribe due to the fact that his broken horns made him an eye blight, a term used to describe the ugly and the dispossessed by the vain elves of Lorwyn. When the Great Aurora happened, Rhys was welcomed back into the tribe and had his horns restored, a fact reflected in his flavour text, which reads, "Whole again in honour and horn." I've also chosen Rhys because he's a hybrid mana card, which, as I mentioned, was one of Shadowmoor's themes, and because he's a notable card due to being a very popular commander. Many cards in Magic generate tokens, creatures, or sometimes artifacts, that are generated by effects rather than played from the hand, and which have no converted mana cost. Rhys the Redeemed is a popular commander for decks which are themed around building tokens. By sinking some mana into him, you can either generate a 1/1 elf warrior token, or you can duplicate all of the creature tokens that are currently in play. That may not sound so impressive if you're just copying the 1/1 Elven Warriors he creates, but if you copy the 5/5 Worms created by Sandworm Convergence, or the 4/4 Beasts created by Rampaging Bailiffs, you can really get some power out, especially because you just keep doubling every turn, duplicating your tokens, and then duplicating the duplicates, and then duplicating their duplicates. Rhys is a fun commander, and fairly easy and cheap to build around as well, though beware of board wipes. Eventide was released in July 2008. It continued Shadowmoor's themes, including several untap and many hybrid cards. It also introduced 2 new mechanics. Retrace, which can be found on several instants and sorceries, and allows them to be cast repeatedly from a graveyard as long as you discard a land each time. These cards are quite overcosted, or just low impact in terms of the effects which they provide, but make up for this due to the fact that they can be cast again and again. But Retrace isn't what we're here to talk about today. No, that would be Chroma, a mechanic which can be found on the card we'll be using to represent the set, Light from Within. Chroma isn't a terribly well-known mechanic, but possibly the closest thing it has to a claim to fame is the fact that it's very, very similar to a much more popular mechanic, Devotion from Theros. Let's compare Light from Within to Heliod, God of the Sun, a card from Theros with Devotion, to see why the latter mechanic eclipses the former. Light from Within is an enchantment, which gives each white creature you control +1/+1 for each white mana symbol and their casting cost. Certainly a powerful effect, especially in mono-white decks. Heliod, meanwhile, is an indestructible enchantment with several beneficial effects, alongside Devotion, which allows him to become a creature if you have 5 or more white mana symbols among permanents you control. Now, I'm not saying Light from Within is a bad card, but there are 2 reasons why Chroma is largely forgotten, whilst Devotion is well remembered. That's due to consistency and theme. First, let's look at consistency. Every single instance of Devotion works in the same way. It always checks permanents on the battlefield. You count the number of mana symbols of a certain colour on permanents you control, and it enables or powers up an effect. Chroma, meanwhile, is far less consistent, and checks several different zones. Light from Within here cares about how many white mana symbols are on individual cards you control. Sanity Grinding checks for blue mana symbols in the top 10 cards of your library. Phosphorus Feast checks your hand, and Umbra Stalker checks cards in your graveyard. This makes Chroma less easy to pick up and learn than Devotion, because on every instance it could work very differently. Next up is Theme. Devotion is very thematically clear, and it's really apparent what it represents. I mean, it's in the name. Devotion effects grow more powerful the more devoted you are to one of Feros's gods, a fact represented artfully in the card of Heliod. The god of white mana comes to life and aids you if you have enough devotion to him, supporting you in your fight because of your piety. Chroma, meanwhile, it's the Greek word for colour, and it cares about colours on cards, but beyond that, what it represents isn't exactly clear. That isn't to say Chroma is a bad mechanic, but rather it's a mechanic which we're unlikely to see again. It is a 10 on the Storm scale, because another mechanic has come along and stolen its thunder. So let's spend a little moment here to remember Chroma, a mechanic which, unfortunately, no one is terribly devoted to. Colours are one of the most unique aspects of Magic the Gathering. The creatures you summon and the spells which you cast are more than just components in a strategy. They're demonstrations of a set of ideals and principles. They allow your deck to represent aspects of yourself or your beliefs in ways that just aren't possible in other games. But what would happen in a world where one of the 5 colours emerged triumphant? A world where their ideology ruled unopposed? Shards of Alara, released in October 2008, sought to answer this question. The world of Alara was once a single plane, but after an event known as the Sundering, Alara split into 5 separate shards. Each of these shards was dominated by a single colour of mana. On each of these 5 small worlds, only one primary colour and its 2 allies are available. So if we look at the colour wheel, each shard features one colour and the 2 colours adjacent to it. Whilst in Ravnica Block, players were encouraged to build 10 colour decks using cards from a selection of 10 guilds, in Alara Block, players are incentivized to build 3 colour decks from one of these 5 shards. Those 5 shards are Bant, the white-centered shard, a world of chivalry and honour, but also hierarchy and status. Its signature mechanic is Exalted, which rewards you for having lots of creatures in play, but only attacking with 1. This represents the shard's love of knightly valour and honourable single combat. Esper, the blue-centered shard, is a world of artifice and experimentation. Every single creature on Esper is an artifact creature, and it features a wide variety of coloured artifacts in lieu of having a mechanic per se. Grixis is the black-aligned shard of undead, ambition and scheming. It makes use of the Unearth mechanic, enabling you to return creatures from your graveyard to play for one final attack, or to activate their effect again before you exile them. Jund is the red-aligned shard of chaos, freedom and giant scaly dragons. Its mechanic is Devour, which enables some of your creatures to devour your others as they enter play, sacrificing the small to power up the strong. Finally, there's the Jungle Shard of Naya, a green-aligned world of untamed nature, home to giant apex predators, as well as some humans, elves, leonin and minotaurs, who live as one with nature. Like Esper, Naya doesn't have a mechanic per se, but it has lots of effects which care about you having a creature in play with 5 or more power. So which card best summarises this set and the 5 different worlds contained within? I'm going to go for Cruel Ultimatum. The ultimatums were a cycle of 5 cards, that's 1 for each shard. They each cost 3 mana of that shard's primary colour, and then 2 mana of the shard's other 2 colours. This makes them pretty difficult to cast, and more than a little impractical, but they make a brilliant coup de grace if you can pull them off. A sort of fanciful flourish you can use to close out the game. Cruel Ultimatum is probably the most famous card in the cycle because of its significance to Magic's story. The artwork depicts a mighty demon, beaten into submission and gazing upwards in fear at an unseen, shadowy figure. Artwork whose message is wonderfully captured in its flavour text, there is always a greater power. The shadowy figure depicted in Cruel Ultimatum is Nicol Bolas. Remember the dragon with the giant nose who was our signature card from Legends? He's back, and now he has greater story significance. Bolas served as the primary villain of Shards of Alara block, and would later act as the main antagonist of Magic's entire storyline, from the release of Kaladesh in 2016 until War of the Spark in 2019, in what's known as the Bolas arc. Cruel Ultimatum is a spell which suits Bolas perfectly, because the over-the-top showmanship in its effect is exactly the Dragon Planeswalker's style. You demonstrate to your opponent how foolish they were to defy you, by forcing them to sacrifice a creature, discard 3 cards, and lose 3 life. The pain which you inflict on them is then mirrored as you reward yourself by returning a creature from your graveyard to your hand, drawing 3 cards, and then gaining 5 life. For all of their impracticality, the ultimatums are certainly beloved cards, and getting them off to clear a path to victory in a Commander game is sure to be a win you'll remember. Because of their popularity, we got 5 more of them in Ikoria in 2020, meaning we now have an ultimatum for every combination of 3 colours. The ultimatums are certainly some of Alara's coolest cards, even if they're also some of its hardest to cast. Conflux burst onto the scene in February 2009. In terms of a narrative, the Conflux was an event orchestrated by Nicole Bolas, which began to merge Alara's shards back together. Mechanically, Conflux didn't bring a lot new to the table. The domain mechanic was introduced, but this had already sort of existed in Invasion Block, albeit without a keyword to represent it. Also, cards of protection from other colours, or which could only target enemy colours, were brought along, having been absent from Shards of Alara. This acts as a representation of the fact that Alara's 5 separate worlds are now merging and becoming increasingly aware of one another. Probably the most notable thing about Conflux is the card which we'll be talking about today. Despite the fact that Shards of Alara block is all about multicoloured cards, this card's mono-coloured. It's one of the most notable removal spells in the game, and one of the strongest. Despite its power, it's available at uncommon rarity. Have you figured it out yet? We're talking about Path to Exile. Path to Exile, as its name would imply, exiles a creature from a game. That creature's controller then fetches a basic land from their library and puts it into play tapped. That may not sound that powerful, but what makes Path to Exile so good is the fact that it does all of this for only a single point of white mana, putting it up there with Swords to Plowshares as one of the most efficient and cheap removal spells in the game. Path to Exile is so exceptional because many of White's single target removal spells are either enchantments, which can later be answered and taken off the board, for example Pacifism or Banishing Light, or only work against creatures that are engaged in combat or tapped, like Divine Verdict or Seal Away. Path to Exile is an unconditional removal spell which costs only a single point of mana and can be cast at instant speed. It's unquestionably one of the best cards of its kind. Even though Path to Exile gives your opponent the upside of being able to ramp out a basic land, this benefit essentially doesn't matter in the late game, at least in most circumstances, and even in the early to mid game, they'd almost certainly rather have a Spawn of Mayhem than another Swamp in play. At the end of the Conflux, the 5 Shards of Alara reunited back into a single world, and Alara was reborn, in a set appropriately entitled Alara Reborn. This set was released in April 2009. To represent the massive contradictory magic suddenly unified as the 5 worlds were slammed together, Alara Reborn has a rather unique gimmick. It's the only set in the history of the game where absolutely every single card is multicoloured. No monocoloured cards here. Even the artefacts, in keeping with Esper's theme, are all at least 2 colours. But although this absolute multicoloured theme is an incredibly unique gimmick, it probably isn't the most memorable thing about Alara Reborn. No. That would be the Cascade mechanic. When a card with Cascade is played, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card with a mana cost lower than the Cascade card you've just played, and then you cast it for free. This ability is just as powerful as it sounds, and was made most notable use of by the card which we'll be using to represent the set, Bloodbraid Elf. Bloodbraid Elf played a key part in modern Jund decks. That's modern decks which use red, black and green mana, for several years. This led to the card being banned in Modern in January 2013. The sort of decks which you would build around Bloodbraid Elf was simple, but undeniably effective. First of all, you get 4 Bloodbraid Elves, naturally, and then you just get a whole bunch of great cards that cost 3 or less mana. Lilianas of the Veil, Tarmogoyfs, Lightning Bolts, etc. Then you play your Bloodbraid Elf on turn 4, and watch with a satisfied smirk as you cascade through your deck for some value, getting 5 to 7 mana's worth of quality cards for a cost of only 4. This is powerful, but ultimately it was deemed not to be game-breakingly so. By February 2018, it was decided that Modern had caught up in power level with Bloodbraid Elf, along with another significantly more infamous card, which we'll be getting to soon, resulting in the 2 cards being unbanned. The Cascade mechanic was deemed too powerful after Alara Reborn, and never ever used again. Until recently. Modern Horizons featured a few Cascade cards, but Commander Legends brought Cascade back in a big way. Most notably on the card Apex Devastator, which costs 10 mana and cascades 4 times in a row as it enters play, ensuring you'll definitely be getting some bang for your buck. For added fun, I'd recommend running Apex Devastator alongside other Cascade cards, like our Elven Berserker friend here, allowing you to just keep cascading on, fetching an increasingly expanding array of threats. So, there we have Lorwyn, Shadowmoor and Alara, worlds focused around creature types, hybrid mana and 3 colour decks respectively. Join me next time, when core sets, which have been slowly trundling along in the background of this series, providing much needed reprints for years, get a massive shake-up, and start incorporating genuinely new cards. We also head to Zendikar, a world of adventures, dungeoneering, and Lovecraftian eldritch monstrosities sealed within the earth. See you all next time.